Hello and welcome. I'm Elizabeth Emery, and this is Hear Her Sports, where we talk to incredible women in sports. Thank you for tuning in. Well, probably like you, I spent many weeks this summer watching the U.S. women's soccer team play in the World Cup and felt such incredible awe at their ability to get the job done. I was struck by how prepared they seemed. There's something about being that prepared that gives you confidence of knowing you've done everything possible up until that important moment. Well, today's guest has much to do with that preparation. U.S. Soccer's high-performance coach Dawn Scott has been involved with the women's team for 9 years, and as you will hear, gets into daily details from hydration to individual player load, each training session and game. I was particularly interested in talking to Dawn about how she incorporated the science behind menstrual cycles into the U.S. women's soccer team's training. I highly recommend the Fit Our Woman app Dawn talks about in the episode. With Fit Our Woman, you can track your cycle, learn more about the 4 phases of the menstrual cycle, and about what the impact each of those phases has on performance. I've always struggled with PMS myself, so the app has been a really great way to take advantage of the strong moments in the month, rather than simply be frustrated with the lows. Dawn also talks about her work with the women's soccer team, strength training, and what's next for the players. You will immediately hear how excited I am to talk to Dawn. I wasted no time and got right into the thick of things, so let's get to it. Well, welcome, Dawn. It is really an absolute thrill to have you here, so thank you. I feel incredibly lucky that you're here.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for asking me to be on. I'm always happy to talk about kind of the things that we do, and it's always nice that there's interest in the areas, if you like, kind of behind the scenes with the US team. So thank you.
Oh, you're very welcome. And I'll have to admit that I've struggled in a way that I haven't in the past to come up with questions to ask you, because really I want to know absolutely everything. I mean, what you're doing and the breadth of how you're involved with the athletes is really something else.
Well, thank you very much. Okay, that could be an interesting journey over the next 40 minutes or so.
Exactly. We don't have time for that. So I did come up with questions.
Okay.
What are your days like? And I also suppose, how do your weeks differ throughout the year? So how are you planning the year? What are your days like? How are you interacting with the athletes?
Sure. Wow. Okay. Lots of big questions straight away. I mean, a typical day, I guess there isn't a typical day is probably the first response, because my day varies whether I'm in camp and also even the nature of that camp. Like, sometimes we'll have a training camp and there might be some testing or monitoring going on. Other times where in a camp, like say a She Believes tournament or the Tournament of Nations, where we've got a lot of games in quick succession. So again, kind of the aim of that camp is very different to a training camp. And then obviously you've also got, kind of major tournaments, so like a World Cup Olympics, where again, it is all about performance and recovery of the players. So I guess I'm involved in anything that affects the physical well-being, physical performance of the women's national team players. So a typical day in camp, I guess I'm kind of starting my day by making recovery shakes for the players for post-training. So I tend to try and get that done before breakfast. And then around breakfast, our players fill in a online kind of wellness app. So basically, I'm usually chasing some of the stragglers, if you like, who we have a rule that you have to fill it in by the end of breakfast, so that if we need to modify any part of training for any individual player, we can do that with the coaches and the medical staff. So I'm usually chasing players kind of during or by the end of breakfast. If a player's checked in with, say, muscle soreness, or they also do a P test and measure their hydration. So if a player checks in their hydration, they're kind of dehydrated, then I'll also just text or go find that player. And if it's kind of a soreness issue, hey, what's going on? Is it something specific? Is it just general? Do we need to modify training for you? If it's a hydration, then I would usually follow them around with some kind of rehydration fluid to make sure they're hydrated ahead of training. Once I've kind of got all of the wellness information, if something flags up medically, I would speak to our head athletics trainer, Steve Stricker, and, combine, see, is it something he's aware of? If it's a player who's returned to play protocol, do we need to modify what they're doing? So it's kind of discussions with him around anything that flags up. Equally, I'm now usually in a van on the way to practice, so I would then also update the head coaches, and if I need to have a conversation with, the coaches around, we either need to modify for the whole group if everybody's flagging something up, or if there's an individual player, we might need to modify part of the training for that player. And then you're in a van, you're at training. I usually get there probably an hour before the team and kind of set up we use live GPS systems, so I'd usually set that up, set out anything nutritionally that players might need before practice, and then set up the warm-up area. And then I'm usually the goalkeepers are out there training early. So during the World Cup, I had a guy helping me, so he would tend to warm up the goalkeepers, and then I would literally just wait for the team to arrive. Once the team arrives, make sure they get their GPS on, get their heart rates on, take them through the movement preparation, take them through the warm-up, and then after the warm-up, kind of monitoring the session live through iPad and the GPS system we have. I'd also time the session, so I'd literally be on Jill Ellis's kind of shoulder the whole time, and, you know, if there's specific times for different parts of the drill, we'd kind of time those, and then it would be move on to the next piece. Again, if we're monitoring individual players, or if there's a player in return to play protocol and we want to see kind of what numbers they're hitting, or are they hitting exactly what Steve and I have projected, then, you know, kind of overseeing that as well. Once training's finished, usher the players into some kind of recovery, whether it's pool, ice tubs, and then we go into lunch. And then if it's a free afternoon, kind of a bit of free time to work on the report from training, and then feed that back to the coaches. If it's a double day, we might be out training again, or we might have a strength session, a lift session that afternoon. So again, we'll be getting set up for that. And then kind of the last thing, end of the day, is always have a medical meeting with Steve and the medical team, and we just discuss every single player. And also kind of during that evening, I would have met with the coaches to plan out practice for the next day. So again, going into that medical meeting, I would know what the plan is for practice, and then we can talk about if any individual player needs to be modified. And then we usually finish our day at 10:30, 11 at night, and then it starts all again the next day, kind of that same process.
Right.
So it's kind of continual communication, using data sets as feedback, using the players, you know, for me, like I've spoken about the data and the feedback of the players, but, you know, the visual with the players, the verbal interaction. I always remember Martin Boucher, who's the head of performance at PSG in France. He kind of said part of his wellness monitoring is literally saying good morning to a player, and how they respond is, you know, kind of how their wellness is.
Oh, that's interesting.
So again, for me, you should never discount the visual and verbal interaction of your players as well. Mm-hmm. It's not all just about numbers and data.
You know, when I was getting ready to talk to you, I was really struck by, again, how detailed and how involved you are with the athletes. Is this really typical of a lot of high-level sports, or is your team very different? I don't know if you know that.
I think the role is kind of my background, I'm obviously from the UK, so I'm sports science trained, and that's kind of how we were trained in terms of like the education piece and then implementing it in sports. So I think yes, but I think what you've also seen evolve. So I've now been kind of working at the elite level for over 20 years. So I guess there has been a lot of kind of involvement in the area. So whereas kind of 20 years ago, there was only one sports scientist, say, working with teams at the elite level. Now you tend to have specialists in certain areas. So you might have a person who just looks at the GPS, the external load data. You might have somebody who just focuses on recovery. You might have somebody who just does the strength work and the lifting. Whereas my kind of background in training was you kind of did it all. So I think yes and no. I think now some systems have more staff who complement each other with their skill sets, and then they have more hands to do that stuff. But then some sports, they do, some of it down to funding availability, funding in the program and so on. But some sports do just have one person who oversees kind of all of that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, I learned about you after the World Cup when so many articles were written about how you've incorporated the players' menstrual cycles into training, and also the work that you've been doing with the research at Fit Our Woman. And, so that we don't skip on some of the basics, can you talk about how you got interested in this area, and also what made you think that tracking menstrual cycles could have an impact on performance?
Yeah, again, through my training, like part of my training was physiology, going through menstrual cycles myself, and, some of the symptoms and how you felt and so on. I was always fully aware, of the menstrual cycle and some of the symptoms players might have. Again, from research, it's very mixed. Some of it alludes to injuries at certain phases, but again, I don't think there's anything that has been done on a big data set that really proves or disproves. Because again, you do need to be then also taken, hormone measures levels and things like that as well. So, and also doing some kind of intervention. So I think there's a couple of things. I think it's hard to get research studies because you need a big data set of injuries or kind of cohort of players to kind of disprove, and some of it potentially could be quite invasive. So I don't think there's a big bulk of research out there right now, but some of it does, kind of more recent suggest that some of the signs and symptoms could be alleviated through training, through diet, through recovery. So again, like I said, I've always had an awareness, and 3-4 years ago, we started just tracking through our wellness platform just the start date of a player's menstrual cycle, so the period phase. So basically players would just put in the first day of their period, and then through the wellness app, it would just let you know kind of the days 1, 2, 3, and then after that you wouldn't get any information until, again, day 1 of their next cycle. But again, some of that was dependent on the player being compliant, inputting that date. So again, you might look at historical data and a player might have 2 or 3 missed cycles, and, without speaking to the player, you're not sure if that was compliance or if that was kind of amenorrhea or missed cycles or so on. And then what we started noticing was around day 1 of the cycle, suddenly kind of fatigue for certain players or muscle soreness or sleep was being affected. And it was kind of, we were noticing it. So again, it was, kind of speaking with the players, are you kind of taking care of yourself and so on, and always knew of the Fit Our Woman app and Georgie Broomvels, who's done some really good research and did a PhD in the area. So again, was in touch with her over the last couple of years of, some of her research and what she was doing. And then really it kind of December last year, we did some correlations between some of the sign symptoms and the phase of the cycle. And, for 4 or 5 of our players, it was clear that they were experiencing, some quite key symptoms leading into the start of their period. So again, conversation with Georgie, kind of how can we try and kind of monitor that? How can we lessen the impact of those? How can we make sure performance isn't affected? And they also developed a platform called Fit Our Coach, where you can basically, so Fit Our Woman is a free app. Fit Our Coach, you pay kind of a small fee for an annual use of that. But it can then basically, they can be linked together. So if a player's filling in Fit Our Woman, you can then link them into a Fit Our Coach app for your team. So then you could see which phase of the cycle they were in. So pretty much menstrual cycle is all about the interactions of estrogen, progesterone. There's kind of 4 key phases where phase 1 starts with the menstrual cycle, the onset of the period. And then once kind of menses stops, you go into phase 2. Where you get an increase, then a decrease of estrogen going into ovulation. And then you go into phase 3 and then phase 4, which is the period right before kind of the start of the menstrual cycle. So again, it was that phase 4 where we were noticing players were either a bit more fatigued. One player in particular was getting a lot of muscle soreness. 2 or 3 players were having sleep affected. So again, Georgia developed this quite in-depth questionnaire survey that players could fill in, and it would really identify how they felt their performance was affected, kind of which stage of their cycle they felt it was affected, and then what some of their signs and symptoms were. So we basically had all of our players kind of complete that in kind of March this year. And then from that, Georgie with her team, she would bring up an individual kind of profile for each player. And then that would really help us dial down, okay, which phase does a player feel like their performance is affected? Where are their biggest symptoms? And then through diet, through recovery, through education on sleep, how can we try and minimize those symptoms so it's not then impacting their performance, or it's lessening the impact of their performance? So we kind of dialed into that a bit. And, a lot of it was also education with the players. Like for me, that is there's 2 things for me. This area is, one is breaking down the taboo of speaking about it. And secondly is the education for the athlete, for coaches working with the athlete, for any support team around the athlete, for parents. Imagine the 13-year-old player on a field somewhere, in the US, in the world, who has some of these symptoms and is too embarrassed to talk about it. So we kind of really did a lot of education this year across the Women's Professional League here, the NWSL, and started breaking down that taboo. Like myself and Julian Haig, who works with me across the league, we went out to the 9 women's pro teams here in the US and, he delivered 5 of the workshops and I did 4 of them. And, like for him being a male, he on the first one was a little bit awkward talking about it. But then, as you speak about it more, you start to break down that kind of awkwardness or embarrassment. Like even me, when I was delivering some of the sessions, could see players at the start of it kind of like fall down in their seats and almost pull their jacket up because they were embarrassed. But But then as you engage them, as you got into the talk and was like, it's okay. Like we're females, we're not mini males, we're not kind of clones of males. We're females and we have different physiology, and this is what happens. And yes, you can sit there and choose to ignore it, or I'm always very much proactive. I always feel like if something can improve a performance or reduce something physically or improve it physically, I'll always kind of chase it and try it. So, again, it was, if you're having these symptoms, like try this and this is going to help you, and this is then going to help your performance.
Yeah, what has been the reaction of the athletes after that initial scrunching down in the seat? I mean, have they been using your suggestions, and have you seen improvement?
Yeah, I mean, even in some of those, like kind of the education workshops alone, like as you progress through the talk, suddenly they would get more engaged, or you would put up some typical symptoms at different phases and you would suddenly see players like the reaction in their face, like, oh, wow, like I get that, or the nodding. And I don't know, like some of the key kind of symptoms are kind of dysmenorrhea, painful periods. You can get bloating, you can get mood changes, you can get reduced recovery, you can get disturbed sleep. So, again, for me, some of those things like disturbed sleep, like, okay, well, what is your sleep hygiene? So can you make sure your bedroom environment is promoting optimal sleep? So anything from, it being dark, it being cool, maybe it's using lavender because lavender is something that promotes sleepiness. Can you use an eye mask? Can you use earplugs? If you need to, there's proteins or there's kind of melatonin or something like that you could use that would actually promote sleepiness a little bit. So for me, it's all about if you can reduce some of these symptoms, then you actually lessen the impact of the menstrual cycle on performance.
Right. You've mentioned the wellness app that your players are filling out. Is that similar to the Fit Our Woman app? And if somebody listening wants to be tracking in the same way, can they use the app well enough?
Yeah, I mean, for me, like the Fit Our Woman app is a great app. It's a free tool. It has a great education platform on there in terms of what the different phases mean. Some of the key areas it talks about is the physiology behind each phase, and then in terms of like training, nutrition, and then recovery, kind of what you should focus on at each phase. So again, some of the thinking is in the phase of 3 and 4, when the body is a little bit more fatigued and not recovering as well, try and maintain your training a little bit, whereas in phases 1 and 2, actually push on your training and develop a little bit. So, the app is very much educational as well. And also it gives examples of, like, say, nutrition, in phase 4, focus on antioxidant foods, and it actually gives recipes that promote some of those foods that would be useful kind of during that phase. So, yeah, absolutely. I mean, like I say, it's free, it's available. So, for anybody who maybe doesn't have the luxury of having support around them, it will be a great tool and visual to use and actually just learn initially some of the phases and some of the kind of symptoms and how you can then overcome some of those areas.
Yeah, I've started to use the app and it's really interesting. They have a lot of check boxes for different symptoms that you're feeling, everything from soreness and illness and stuff. So it's really fascinating. I'm wondering how I'm going to do the analysis, but that's the next phase.
Indeed.
How are you meshing the discoveries that you're making about the menstrual cycles with, the training plan that you had been using prior to all that?
I mean, I would say right now we haven't really changed training kind of based on menstrual cycle. Again, kind of my thoughts and philosophy, and, I've spoke to Georgie quite a bit about this. For me, like a couple of the key phases where some of the symptoms are greatest are kind of phase 4 is probably a big one, because that's when chances are kind of body's bloated a little bit more from water retention. There's a greater need for antioxidants. Recovery is slightly reduced, and then sleep can also be affected. So again, for me, if a player can try and address those areas and almost like negate the impact of those, they can then go into their training actually in a better recovered state than if they've not addressed them. So for me, like, I feel like you can reduce the symptoms, minimize the symptoms, really do that through diet, through nutrition, through recovery and sleep. And actually you don't then need to modify your training because, you know, for me, that's what it's all about, is if you can negate those impacts of the symptoms, then your training should actually be okay. And, you know, I know you said it where you've kind of won races, won medals on the first day of your period, and, you know, kind of gold medals have been won and lost on the first day of a menstrual cycle. It's, you can overcome it. I think it's just you have to be proactive to do it. I think the only thing I would say is, you know, during phase 1, which is the period and kind of onset of the menstrual cycle, potentially that is when the ligaments can be a little bit more lax, especially around the knee. So again, you know, there has been some thoughts around, is there an increased risk of knee injuries, ACL injuries in females at that time? But again, for me, like, what is your injury prevention program? What is your strength program? Because those bits combined with lessening the symptoms in that phase 1 of your period, like, should then reduce the chances of actually getting injured during that phase 1. Because again, if you're not addressing those symptoms in phase 4, which are recovery, sleep, kind of antioxidants, bloating, then you're potentially going to phase 1 less recovered, less sleep because you've not addressed them. So that combined with the looser ligaments, the more lax ligaments, yes, for sure, can lead to increased injury risk. But if you're lessening those symptoms and you're stronger, you've paid attention to your injury prevention, then, you know, phase 1, you should be able to tolerate those kind of trainer loads, trainer levels.
Right. I can't remember where I saw this, but you said it's good to be on top of this stuff before it happens, which I think is probably the greatest benefit of this app. Is it's just sort of a reminder, like, hey, you know, it's phase 4, you know, pay attention.
Yeah. And also for me, like, the more you track it and monitor it, the more you're going to get to know about it and the more educated you are. Because again, a menstrual cycle can vary anywhere from 21 to 35 days. So, you know, if you're somebody who's 21 days compared to 35 days, then your duration in each phase is going to be different.
Right.
Similar, the actual period can vary from 2 to 7 days in terms of kind of blood flow. So, you know, the amount of iron and blood you lose in the 2 or 7 days is going to be different. You're going to have heavy bleeders, you're going to have light bleeders. For me, kind of piecing all of that together. So again, you know, phase 1, like, what's your iron intake, and, you know, how is that affected by how long you are actually in that phase 1, and, you know, kind of whether you are a heavy or a light bleeder. And the iron is important in the blood to carry the oxygen to the muscles. So again, if that's reduced because you're in phase 1 and you're a heavy bleeder, then that is going to affect your performance and you are going to be more tired. So again, that's for me like the education piece. And the more you read about it or the more you track your own symptoms, then the more potential you've got for then actually, like you just said there, like addressing it before it actually becomes an issue.
Right. You've talked a lot about recovery and sleep. What are your strategies that you're recommending to the players to get enough recovery, and what, you know, like really specifically, what are you having them do?
Yeah, I mean, we, again, kind of between Steve, our head athletic trainer, and myself, like we're of the mindset kind of make everything available. Obviously, with the senior women's team, you know, they're adult women, and I'm not going to make those players do every single strategy. So it's, okay, here's the strategies available. Like, you use what you feel works for your body. For me, it's not rocket science what we have available. First and foremost, it's the nutrition, it's the hydration. You know, I think sometimes we forget they're part of the recovery process. So again, what is your nutrition? What is your hydration? So they would be the first pieces of that recovery. And then we just make everything available from, you know, we do a cool down at the end of training, we stretch, we have the big inflatable legs available, which just promotes blood flow around the body. We have ice tubs available, pool session, promote a light gym workout, you know, riding a bike. For me, it's all about increasing blood flow. So any method that you can use, implement that increases blood flow is going to be beneficial. So again, there's mixed research in terms of kind of recovery tights, compression tights, compression socks. The physiology behind it is that it kind of compresses, so then promotes blood flow. So they're kind of the big ones. We have kind of massage therapists available when we travel. So again, kind of making that available for players. So really just promote all of those different tools and methods. And then, like I say, it's kind of on the players to piece together exactly what they feel works for them. And then kind of from a sleep perspective, again, we did some sleep tracking with a kind of sleep watch in May time, and players wore that for 2 weeks, and that was in during a camp, and we crossed time zones. So it really helped us look at individual players in terms of the duration and quality of the sleep that players had in those times, if they were affected by time zones. And then for me, again, it goes back to the education piece of, what is good sleep hygiene and what are you doing right before you go to bed? I'm so guilty of it myself, but are you reading your phone? Are you watching TV right before you go to bed, which is emitting light and absolutely something you shouldn't do, but we all do it. So what is your sleep routine? Do you have a sleep routine? So again, if you have a sleep routine, research has shown that your sleep quality and duration is more effective than if you don't have a routine. So again, what are you doing right before you go to bed? Again, those things I said before, like how dark is the room? Again, if it's a light room, the light is basically telling your body to be awake and not really promoting sleep. So again, a darkened room, a cooler room, bed sheets, bedding that is comfortable, lavender if you need it, kind of rub it on temples, head, wrists, or even feet. We had some players do that and felt it worked. Spray your pillow with lavender. You could have a lavender bath before you go to bed. So again, lavender is a big one. And then the other thing which kind of we use, which has helped some players with sleep, is cherry juice. So again, some of the makeup in the cherry juice can help promote sleep as well.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah. So we've used that for a while. So so they're just kind of promoting good habits. Like again, it's absolutely similar to the menstrual cycle. It's all about education, awareness, and forming good habits and doing it every single day. Like I always say to our players, they have to be kind of athletes 24/7. It's, you miss a day, you miss an hour, and especially in your tournament, kind of when we're in France and you got 7 games in 27 days, like you miss one of those windows and, you set yourself back, and it shows in a tournament like that.
Yeah, you did an impressive job keeping everybody healthy and active and ready to go during a month. A month is a long time to be on the road and ready.
It was actually 50 days.
Okay, 2 months.
I'm known as the countdown queen, but we actually started our journey in New Jersey with our final send-off game around about the 22nd of it was before then, around about the 22nd of May, and then from there went into England for a training camp for 2 weeks, and then into France. So it's again, it's a collective of working very closely with our technical coaches in terms of the planning and periodization of training kind of around the games, of individual needs for players, mapping out our actual World Cup games and what training we need to do in and around those. Even once you get to the World Cup, you're kind of differentiating between players who are now accumulating a lot of playing minutes in the games, and then, some players who are playing moderate amount, and then you almost have some who are playing very little. But you also need to make sure those players who are not playing much are always ready for if they need to be playing. So their training is very much different to the players who are accumulating playing time. So kind of that plan and periodization is obviously a big part of that. And, the other piece again is incredible work that the medical team did out in France. We had 4 athletic trainers, 2 team physicians and 3 massage therapists. And, those guys worked around the clock. We had the medical meeting at 10:30 p.m. every night, and those guys would be treating and doing hands-on work until 10:30 most nights. So, I credit to those guys because they were the ones hands-on in camp, keeping those players healthy every single day and just making sure they were ready for every training session, every game.
Yeah, those guys are always undervalued or not spoken about enough. They do a ton of work.
Yeah, sure.
And it's always late at night, early in the morning. So,
yeah, for sure.
What's next in your research, in your implementation of, the things that you're learning, training, goals for the next 4 years, or maybe, for Tokyo?
Yeah, I think there's a few things. I think with the menstrual cycle, we did it just with the US women's team in these few months. We're hoping to do that across the whole NWSL. which I think, there's a few things. For me, it would be immense to get that kind of and level of feedback to 200 plus elite female players here in the US. So that's first and foremost. But the second piece for me is raising the awareness and those players being pioneers in this area, because there's nothing out there, which I alluded to at the start in terms of the research. There's very little out there really in terms of kind of some of the key symptoms and effects and how to overcome those. So, I think if we can monitor those players and then potentially publish some of that data and information, it means that, players who don't have this level of support can see that and read it and hopefully, kind of make that have an impact on themselves as well. So that would be kind of one thing I'm really passionate about trying to drive, and then trying to also do that with our youth teams here. And then even, kind of below that, the development academies and club system here in the US, I think would be, phenomenal, again, to have that exposure and just make it more of an aware topic. So I think that's kind of one big area that I'm passionate about and would like to kind of try and drive and push through. Other than that, right now, it's trying to keep our national team players healthy. They pretty much finished the World Cup and within 1-2 weeks were back with their NWSL clubs, which, is very physically and mentally challenging, given the intensity of the games at the World Cup. So, some players have been tired and fatigued, and we're trying to work with them and with their clubs to make sure they get through the season healthy. So that's kind of main thing for those players. And then once the NWSL season's finished and the national team program's finished for this year, those players, again, it will be very individually customized. They'll have kind of a break, because they've not had that since the World Cup. They'll have a break, and then we literally build again for... I mean, again, it's going to vary.
Right.
It's going to vary by player, just depending on, a lot goes into it in terms of how much they played the World Cup, how much they've then played in the league, what their health status is, that kind of thing. So, we've had a few players. Megan Rapinoe, since the World Cup, has just come back 2 months after the World Cup to start playing with their club. So, she's in a very different situation to, say, a Sam Mewis, who played a lot of minutes at the World Cup and then has played pretty much every game for a club. So, it's going to be very different based on where players are at and what they've accumulated by the end of the season. But we don't really get a long off season, because pretty much in January we have a training camp to get ready for Olympic qualification. Like, the team hasn't qualified for Tokyo yet, so that's not really on our radar. The Olympic qualification is in January or February, so that's kind of the first step to that process. So back to your question, long-winded answer, probably like 2 to 3 weeks for players. Like I say, it's not very long, because we don't really have a big window, and potentially those players are looking at kind of, if we successfully negotiate qualification for Olympics, it would kind of be the latter part of 2020 when they get a longer break. So 2 to 3 weeks. And, for some players, it might be 2 weeks, and then it's just a week, build them back into training, and then it's, kind of straight back into getting ready for the January camp and selection for Olympic qualifiers.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah.
Speaking of a lot, you talk about load and sort of keeping track of load for each of the players. Can you describe what load means and what you're calculating?
Sure. I mean, we use kind of a few tools. So our key tool is using GPS system, which measures the external physical load for players, which is kind of distance covered. We have certain thresholds. So we look at high speed run and we look at sprint distance. We look at number of sprints that a player completes every week. So again, we have the luxury where we work very closely with the NWSL, and we have that data for the players in the league. And then we also have that data for the players when they come in with the national team. So that's kind of a key external load. Then we also collect heart rate data. So again, players wear heart rate strap, and then based on their own individual max heart rate and the zones we prescribe, we can monitor what their internal load is. And then the other thing, through, again, the wellness app, the players will just fill in an RPE scale. So basically, how hard was that session on a scale of 1 to 10? That just helps us to track, again, internal measure of how hard a player feels a session was. And that's something, kind of an RPE scale is free, like anybody can use that. And again, that just sometimes just validates maybe it's a session that a player has done. So really through a combination of those 3 data streams, then we look at individual loads for players. Again, we collect the data in games, so almost have like a baseline of this is a typical game load for this player. And again, that is individual to the player because it's very different based on position, based on formation, based on tactics. So we almost have like a profile for each player. And then, we have a train and load for them on a weekly basis, which is based off a little bit their game load. So yeah, that's kind of what we look at away from camp. And then that's what we kind of look at when we're in camp in terms of which metrics players hit and kind of what their loads are, and depending on which day it is in relation to game day.
Right. How important is strength training and gaining more strength as part of the whole that you're working with?
It's absolutely, for me, for any athlete, and maybe especially female athletes, it's fundamental to everything that we do. I think it is so important for injury prevention, for having, healthy, strong athletes. But then also for me, strength is a basis to developing every other component of fitness. Like power is like speed at strength. And, to be fast, you need to be strong. So for me, it is the basis to everything that you do. And, for me as well, like the stronger you are, the quicker your recovery is going to be. Strength is a component of aerobic fitness. So for me, it is so important to have a good strength program. And, that can vary from, kind of pre-season overloading the players, aiming to lift heavy, to then in season more maintenance through body weight or cables, medicine balls, anything like that. But for me, it's such a key component of everything that we do.
Do you have sort of go-to exercises that everybody does?
Yes and no. I mean, again, kind of, I always just like to hit some of the key kind of areas. So we always do, and again, this isn't rocket science, some kind of squat, whether it's front squat or back squat or a trap bar squat. Again, that depends on the individual player and, any issues they might have with being able to do one of those different three. So kind of strengthening hips, glutes, hip thrust, whether that is with a weighted bar, whether it's a medicine ball, whether it's just kind of unweighted body weight, kind of glute bridge or using cables. But I think kind of hip thrust is another good one. Upper body as well, kind of important, just a vertical push exercise, just a push press, and then similar horizontal bench press or something similar. So, again, I think some of those exercises we just have as base components, a deadlift, kettlebell, dumbbell, or again, weighted bar. But, for me, just hitting some of the major muscle groups, and then around that, you can just build or add in anything else that you think, is necessary for those individual players. Some single leg work, whether that's a variation on an RDL or a split squat. But again, probably hip thrust, some kind of deadlift, and then hitting your upper body as well, and then just building everything else around that, really.
Cool. That's cool. Well, as the last question, I want to ask a bigger picture question, because your team has had obvious incredible success on the field, but they've been going through so much else. How, it just feels so weighty. So I guess, how are they managing that stress, and how are they going to continue to manage that, through this trial that's coming up, the discrimination lawsuit, and also the qualifications for Tokyo?
I mean, obviously the stuff off the field, like I don't get involved in that. First and foremost, I just do my job. But, what I've always, I've been with this team now for 9.5 years, and, they've gone through a lot of different things on and off the field. But what I always know about this team is that they're incredibly driven, incredibly professional, and extremely focused. So, I have no doubt that when, as they are now, they're all focused and they're backing with their NWSL teams, that, when the time comes for Olympic qualification, these players will be totally locked on and focused. And, they put those things that are going on kind of off the field out of focus and purely focus on the task in hand, because, at the end of the day, they're competitors, they're winners, they're mentally tough and driven, and they want success. And, that's just how I've always found them. So I'm not one bit concerned that they won't do that kind of when we get to that Olympic qualification kind of process.
It's very commendable that it doesn't add to their stress, or doesn't seem to add to their stress. I like it.
Yeah, I'm sure, but I think they just kind of find individual coping strategies. But like I say, this isn't the first time that there's been anything like this, and the players have always just focused on the task in hand. Some of it was happening prior to the World Cup, but
right.
The players put it to the side, and they had a decent summer. They had a successful summer. So I think, that's what I've always found with them, that they're very focused because they are professionals in terms of what they do.
Well, I'm very happy that they're on this fight. It's nice to have them representing us, so thank them.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, indeed.
Wonderful. And thank you so much. It's been really wonderful having you here. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. Well, thank you again for your time and for asking me to come on. I really appreciate it.
Well, thanks everybody for listening. I'm extremely grateful to Dawn Scott for making time to be on the show, and to Aaron from U.S. Women's National Soccer Team for doing all the work to put the call together. Subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen to podcasts, and tell your friends about all these incredible women. Subscribe to the Hear Her Sports newsletter for thoughts about the episodes, related stuff I'm reading, updates, and news about what's coming up. Our logo is by Agnes Studio, and music by the band Gold Mines. I'll be back in 2 weeks. Bye-bye.
Hey there, my name is Michael Laminato, and this is Pit Pass F1, a brand new podcast that'll take you closer to the action of the world's most prestigious motorsport. From Monaco to Miami and Australia to Azerbaijan, Pit Pass F1 is on the ground and has you covered. Esteemed F1 journalists Julianne Cerasoli and Chris Medland will take you inside the sport every round. They'll keep you up to date with the latest news breaking in Formula One and the most influential views shaping the world of Grand Prix racing. Every Friday, we'll be bringing you a track guide and race preview, and Chris and Ju will be in your feed every morning from Saturday through to Monday to keep you up to date on all the day's action on and off the track. So if you want to be in the know on the latest in Formula One, subscribe wherever you get your favourite podcasts and visit us at evergreenpodcasts.com. Pit Pass F1, a brand new show for Evergreen Podcasts.